Okay, it's Tuesday. This is our warm up for today. We have three drawings by one artist. I want you to tell me what they have in common. What's something that is in all three of these? Shapes, colors, anything like that. I just want you to recognize the general theme this artist likes to work with. And that goes beyond just the basic visuals of there's this in every single one. Is there something thematically that's connecting the three also? Something about them that's similar ideas throughout. All right, so take like 5 minutes of that. Be right back.
I don't want you give it. Through my blood, like I'm so inside you, baby. You're so kind, you won't slow up. You're so kind, you won't slow up a fight. You gotta say, 'cause in the same life, she got away. Hungry for strength, hungry for light, I will take you.
Okay, so let's see what these have in common. This is actual like a professional critique of these pieces, kind of saying what they have in common. So Kevin Luckbart draws doors into parallel universes. So that's something in common that might not be super obvious, that these are all passageways into or out of somewhere else. So there's a commonality to the kind of color, and there's like triangles and squares, and they're all at this particular angle, but there's also something thematically putting them together. And he mostly uses the color blue. It reminds me of a world of dreams he turned to when he got bored at school. So it's supposed to be like that ballpoint pen blue. It's like taking doodles you did in school when you were bored and taking them to this super professional level makes an interesting contrast. There's a contrast between high structured stuff like rooms and walls. It's what's really good at this like 3/4 angle, and then the wildness of nature and stuff like that. So that's, as long as you have something like that, or at least kind of observed that, that's what we're looking for in this one. Do you see those commonalities between them? Because today we're going to get started on the principles of design, and that has a lot to do with visual commonalities, things that like link images together, and it's going to be through any kind of artwork you can name. You should be able to see these principles in it, things that make a good image, things that work for composition. And that's where okay, so principles of design. The first big chunk we talked about was the elements of art. There's 7 of those. There's 8 principles of design. Now, these ones are really interconnected. Any good artwork is going to have most of these, if not all of these. They're not absolute rules. That's what the mistake people tend to make, is that it has to have all of these to the maximum. It doesn't. These are tools. These are to help you make a better drawing. If yours feels a little flat, a little bit like just a floating sketch in Sketchbook and doesn't feel like a nice finished piece of artwork that you could hang on the wall or that you'd want to give to somebody, take a look at this list and see if you can use any of these to make your image more full, more satisfying. So what are they? If you're in the classroom, you're seeing this list right above the board. So these are the ones you need to know for your exams in this class. These are the ones Florida is going to ask you about. But in the bigger world, in the art world, they change. These are not absolute. These are not the only 8. There's lots more. But these are the 8 you need to know. Okay? So let's see some examples. Let's start talking about them. The very one at the top right there, we got pattern, balance, contrast, rhythm, proportion, movement, emphasis, and unity. And we started talking about emphasis already because it's kind of the easy one. It's just when you want to see something in particular. But let me show you some more examples of these. Unity and variety. Like I said, variety, not one of ours, but they tend to put them together like this. Unity is the sense that everything kind of goes together, is connected, that there's a general theme. Variety is when there's a lot of difference, when things are completely unconnected. Now, both of these are tools, and they say different things and have different emotions, they're different feelings. But for us, we're not worried about variety. We talk about difference when we talk about contrast, which is a different one of these. Unity, and we'll get deeper into unity. Like I've said before, it's the hard one to really quantify, so we'll do a whole thing on unity. It's not the one we're going to really focus on today. Balance is the sense that there's enough stuff on both sides of the page. Now, the one you're more familiar with is probably symmetrical, which is it's the exact same on both sides. It's a mirror image. You can fold it in half. The other one is asymmetrical balance. And this, like unity, we'll talk more about as we get to it. But asymmetrical balance is when there's the same amount of junk on both sides, but it's not the same shape. You can't fold it in half and make it perfectly match. So like this one has one big ball on one side and 3 little balls on the other side. It still equals the same amount of mass. It's just distributed differently. Contrast. Contrast is difference. And that's important for one of the other ones we're going to talk about. When things are different, black versus white, rough versus smooth, that's contrast. There's a severe difference between the two. And contrast naturally creates drama. You want something to be more dramatic? Crank up the contrast. Make it more severe. Like when we're doing shadows and stuff like that, you want it to be a more dramatic, serious drawing. Really crank up the dark and the light in those shadows. Have less of those midtones. You want it to be pleasant and nice and not so dramatic. You make it a little more subtle and blend it out a little more. That's what contrast does. Emphasis, we've talked about this one, and you can see all 3 of these examples are using that same thing where it's a field of black and white and you have one spot of red. That makes you look at it. That is not the only kind of emphasis. It's pretty similar to contrast. You can create emphasis with contrast. The contrast here is color versus non-colored. You could do it with texture where everything else is really smooth and you have one rough spot. That's going to create emphasis. You have very little line work and then a spot with a lot of line work. That's going to create emphasis. It's that contrast. It's just a specific spot of contrast. It's not everywhere. It's a really specified little spot. And that's kind of what emphasis is. It's a focal point. Scale and proportion. I tend to call this one size quite a bit. Proportion is things getting smaller in a like mathematical equation. Like this one's exactly 1/3 of each one before it kind of thing. But it's mostly this one just is a change in size. Making something really big against something really small gives it a tremendous sense of power and importance and things like that. That's what this is. Plus, it also works for things like when you do really tiny artwork. The fact that it's small is what makes it kind of interesting and makes you fascinated to look at it. That would go under proportion and scale. It has to do with the size of something. Movement's an interesting one. We're going to talk about this one a little bit more in a second. Basically, it's the sense that things are moving through the page. Now, that can be action. That can be your character jumping, running, diving, whatever, all those verbs. But it's not necessarily. It also is how your eyeballs move through the page. So like those ones over there that are all squiggly, your eyes are following those squiggly lines through the page. Now, the stuff in it's not necessarily moving, but your eyes have to move around through it. It's how we guide people's eyes through a composition. The one I really want to get to today is the last one is pattern. And now pattern is sometimes called repetition because it's when you repeat something. That's how you create a pattern. You take one thing, repeat it, and you got a pattern. That's it. That's the entire equation for pattern. But let's look at some of them so you can kind of see the difference between natural and artificial patterns and kind of see what I'm talking about. Okay, so our first two patterns, we got the tile one on the left there. That is actually a really old tile pattern from Portugal. And if you ever go to like Lisbon in Portugal, the entire city is covered in these really patterned tiles. They get extremely intricate because you have a whole society working on these intricate little patterns. And when you make a pattern with tiles, you basically have to make the exact same pattern on every tile that's going to connect to the other ones and create a like linking like whole pattern. That's kind of what gives it its sense of unity. The one next to it, you just have some plants. They're all succulents. There's some varying colors and stuff like that, but it's what's known as a natural pattern. You have how it's planted is creating lines, but also the plant itself is growing out in this like concentric circle pattern. And that's making it kind of interesting to look at. That's why we like looking at things like flowers. Our minds naturally enjoy pattern. We like order. We like things to be where they're supposed to be. Patterns gives us that sense. If you think back to that beauty video we watched very early on, it talked about how we know like a plant is healthy if it's nice and symmetrical, and it was like something instinctual that we learned that symmetry equals good early on. These ones, pretty simple. You got some vertical and horizontal lines. Then next to that, you have some random lines. It's still the same kind of line. They're all the same thickness. They all have the same angular. Like, there's no curved lines in there. There's no extra thick ones. It's the same kind of line. So it still counts as a pattern. This one's really interesting. They're using pattern and contrast to create emphasis. So you got the pattern is the orange holes in the white wall. And then that like blue curve is kind of like the thickness of the wall. And that's repeated over and over again, so we get this nice sense of it. Then you have one circle that's blue. We can actually see that it's a guy holding a balloon. So the contrast of blue and orange is creating that spot of emphasis. It's only happening in one spot, so we know it's emphasizing that one spot. And it's built on a pattern. So you can see how a lot of these things are interconnected. And then there's just these pages of like pattern varietals. And you can see they're kind of all, like especially the one on the left, they're kind of all based on the same idea. It's a curved line overlapping. But what can you do with it? How can you change that each time to keep making new patterns over and over and over? So patterns. Sometimes it seems really obvious what they are, but you can do a lot with them. Like we're talking about textures, it's a kind of pattern. You can fill in space with it. You can really create a much more interesting composition with just pattern. You see a lot of cultures in this world, especially like Islamic art, they can't draw people in their religion. It's like sinful. So they get really into patterns. And we'll talk about Islamic art, but it is the most intricate, detailed pattern work you'll ever see. Really interesting stuff. And when you're limited to that, that's the only thing you can do, people get really, really into it. And there's some like mathematical absolute qualities about it. If you're kind of OCD and you like things to be perfect, patterns are great for that. But here's your assignment. I want you to do this today and tomorrow. So it's going to take you 2 days, so it should be fairly intricate. I want you to combine two of those principles of design, movement and pattern. And I want you to create movement using a pattern. I'll do a real simple one for you real quick. I'm just going to create a swirl by like repeating this little dash mark. But I just want to make the eye go a certain direction. For right now, it's just spiraling into the middle. The tough thing about patterns in this kind of work is the repetition. And that's the other name for pattern, is repetition. Just doing it over and over and over. It can be a little mind-numbing, but the more lines you do, the more impressive it is, the more interesting it is to look at. And obviously that's just a few seconds, but this is kind of what we want to do. We're creating movement, we're creating this spiral with line. I want you guys to do something different. If this is all you can come up with and you want to do something similar, go ahead, just make it much more complicated. There's other ways to do it. You could definitely make it more like a wave where one side's coming in like this, and the other side's coming out. There's lots and lots of ways to complicate patterns. If you want to look some up, feel free. But this is what we're working on today and tomorrow. So I want you to take a piece of paper and start working on building movement with a pattern. Okay, guys? See you in 2 days.